change. It was also when pop culture started being influenced by movies and Hollywood stars. Many exciting things were happening in the world in the 20s. Time magazine was first published. Walt Disney Company was founded. The first Winter Olympics was held in France. And maybe most importantly, bubblegum was invented. Finger waves were all the trend in the 20s, and Colleen Moore, an actress in black and white silent movies, inspired an entire generation of girls to go out and get bob haircuts. She wore her finger wave bob alongside her classic flapper look, which at this time pushed the boundaries into a modern era, because her dresses showed a little bit of leg. Since most men wore hats during this time, slick back hair and the use of one of the first men's products called Brilliantine made it possible to take their hat off and still have their hair be smooth and flat. Growth was everywhere in the 20s until 1929, when the crash of Wall Street began what we know as the Great Depression, and the 30s was defined by it. Style and fashion got much tamer and less extravagant. Though the Great Depression at this time overshadowed everything else, innovation was still quietly taking place. Comic books, including Superman and Batman, were being published. Black and white movies now had sound, and movies like Gone with the Wind and Wizard of Oz began to bring back more Hollywood influence on hair and fashion. Clark Gable, commonly referred to at the time as the King of Hollywood, inspired the young men into a style of more serious look that represented responsibility and success. Because remember, during the Great Depression, jobs were much harder to come by. Because most had lost nearly everything during this time, clothing had to become more durable, which gave rise to the popularity of what we know today as denim. In the 30s, it was not socially acceptable for men to have hair that touched their ears or their neck, and most men simply could not afford to go to a barber. So many men turned to at-home haircuts to keep the edges of their hair at an acceptable length, while the top became longer. This, in time, would begin to be known as the tapered haircut. For women, Katharine Hepburn's androgynous clothing style set the standard for the way women still wear a business suit today. Trousers, collared shirt, and blazer, which certainly strayed from the typical dresses of that time. And we must not forget that the 30s drove the popularization of platinum blonde hair worn by Jean Harlow. Even though she claimed her hair was not chemically altered, later in the decade it was reportedly achieved with a weekly application of ammonia, Clorox bleach, and Lux soap flakes, but became such a sought-after look that it drove the advancements of what we know as lightener today. In 1941, the attack on Pearl Harbor that pushed the U.S. into joining World War II abruptly changed the direction of fashion. In the 40s, Americans now watched and saw things that were beyond imagination on a new invention called a television set. Imagine, back at this time, to now be able to watch things that were happening on a global scale. The atomic bombings of Hiroshima and Nagasaki in 1945, and the very first image from space in 1946. On the big screen, Rita Hayworth was a shining light in the midst of all the destruction of the 40s. Her shortened dress from calf length to knee length was not a choice or fashion statement at the time. It was because fabric was being rationed to supply military uniforms. During the war, when World War II planes would spin horizontally upon their return as a sign of victory, Hollywood stars would soon take that name for this iconic hairstyle, victory bowls. Also note that in the 40s, aerosol hairspray was developed by a manufacturer who originally began manufacturing aerosol cans for World War II insecticides. And by 1964, hairspray became the highest-selling beauty product on the market. The 50s can be classified as a time of discovery and glamour, because by the mid-50s, more than half of all American households had a TV set. The first ascent of Mount Everest, the discovery of DNA, the launch of Sputnik, and the beginning of NASA. While the world watched all of this on their brand new TVs, fantasy movies like Cinderella, Sleeping Beauty, and Alice in Wonderland brought glamour and elegance to the forefront of fashion for both men and women. Men's fashion took a turn for a more dramatic look. moving from the simple, dapper haircut of the 40s to the greaser hairstyles and the pompadour. Now, this was a major shift for men because this decade was characterized as being in a state of in-between. Men were moving away from traditional conservatism and began leading rebellions that denounced mainstream American culture. Known as the Beat Generation, rebellion against the status quo of the time, racism, segregation, poverty, and women's rights gave plenty of choice for men in the 50s to find something to stand up for. The pompadour became notorious once these motorcycle riding rebels started wearing them, but then became more fashion statements once singers such as Frank Sinatra and Elvis Presley brought the look to Hollywood. The launch of Miss Universe set the stage for housewives all over the world to now see what they should strive to achieve. The pressure for women to achieve these glamorous looks was so strong that even the ads of the time would show women with perfect hair and makeup cooking and cleaning. The launch of the first one-step hair color line by Clairol in 1950 now allowed women to color their hair lighter for the first time, and actresses like Audrey Hepburn and Marilyn Monroe were setting the new standard for women in fashion. The 60s were a turbulent period in history. After the prosperous 50s, the 60s came with price increases, new wars, and the rise of countercultures, protests, and riots. Innovation continued to escalate faster than ever. The construction of the first laser, sending the first human into space, and Eliza, the first chatbot, brought new ideas and possibilities into the minds of Americans. Electronic companies like Samsung began to emerge during the 60s, bringing a whole new era of possibilities. In the 60s, women began to get more extreme with their hair and were willing to begin to take more risks with their fashion choices. The miniskirt was a shocking departure from the glamour gowns of the 50s. The introduction of the angled bob by Vidal Sassoon and Audrey Hepburn's bold new pixie cut, young women now had options and it was socially acceptable for them to show it. Hairstyling tools became available to have in your home, including blow dryers and electric curling irons, which allowed new hairstyling options. Many women began mimicking the hair of First Lady Jackie Kennedy Onassis, who popularized the beehive and was the epitome of class and style due to the first televised presidential election. Young women were not the only ones experimenting with options for their hair. Men were looking more towards British culture, and with the first record release of a small band called the Beatles, mop-top hairstyles and longer hair for men became popular. Because hair began to become more tied to personal identity in the 60s, it drove our industry to massive expansion and demanded more diverse offerings. Now, if we say the 60s began breaking away from the conservative fashions of the 50s, the 70s got rid of them altogether. Commonly referred to as the Me Decade and the disco era, the 70s ushered in the celebration of individualism. And as political scandal rocked this decade, distrust of government was at an all-time high. With NASA launching Voyager 1 and 2 and the first space station, the first Star Wars movie being released, and the mass production of personal computers, possibilities began to seem endless. Men that let their hair grow longer to show protest against the social norms gave rise to styles like the afro. Different textures became identifiers for both culture and an emblem of self-pride. Longer short haircuts for men were popularized by singers like Mick Jagger and David Bowie, and was really the first true unisex haircut, which became a turning point in our industry. Because for the first time ever, men needed to visit a salon that knew how to cut it instead of a traditional barbershop. For women, the 70s was an important turning point for our industry. Decades leading up to the 70s, fashion icons identified women by what they wore more than their hair, because most women tried to conform to social norms. Farrah Fawcett is a perfect example of this transition. She was not an icon because of what she wore. She was an icon for her hair that created her identity. The 80s will always be remembered for its materialism and consumerism. The decade also saw a rise of cable networks like MTV, and the music video was born. A brand new sense of the awareness of human mortality was heightened, primarily driven by the AIDS epidemic, And the awareness and the focus on individual health became so strong that it resulted in workout wear becoming a statement in street fashion. It seemed everything in the 80s got bigger and bolder, including the hair. Services like crimping irons, and stronger hairspray were needed. Anything it took to make your hair bigger and bolder began to trend. And the hangout spot, once you were ready, the mall, which is why this style was commonly referred to as mall hair. Makeup trends also got bolder, kicked off by Princess Diana wearing blue eyeliner to match her blue eyes. And women everywhere began to transition from natural makeup to bolder colors. Driven by the popularity of rock music videos, men went for longer hair and mullets, or mohawks, paired with their favorite bandana, and Lionel Richie sported the Jerry curl, which now gave those sporting a traditional afro in the past new options for looser curl to mimic the rock icons. In the 90s, America was making great strides in creating more complex technologies. The launch of the Hubble Space Telescope, climate change, and the link between carbon dioxide and the Earth's atmosphere. Dolly the sheep as the first successful cloned mammal. The 90s was a decade where pop culture took flight. Dance moves were born, and Furbies were impossible to get. The most iconic 90s female haircut of choice was the Rachel haircut. Jennifer Aniston said this haircut was hard to style and had to go to the hairdresser often to get it blown out. From the 80s prime to the smooth 90s, flat irons became a must-have tool at home, or you were faced with a need for a weekly love service. Cutting a face frame into the haircut and adding chunky highlights became mainstream to mimic the look. For men, the popularity of grunge music gave rise to a simpler, messier look, including Kurt Cobain's unruly mid-length hair and shorter, spiky styles with frosted tips, like Lance from NSYNC. The launch of Google in the late 90s transformed the 2000s into a whole new world of surfing the internet, self-education, and an explosion of new opportunities. Day trading stocks from your personal computer, the launch of iPod and smartphones, and the video gaming revolution. Women's haircut fashion was focused on a new trend called precision haircutting. Precision haircut demands, like this stacked bob, forced all of us to begin honing our haircut skills rather so much on our styling skills. Because of the launch of smartphones and Facebook in the later part of the decade, hair trends took a new turn, driven by a new fashionista generation. These fashionistas drove brands to success, like Juicy Couture, which is a strong representation of how the past decades of fashion and hair trends all began to combine into new looks. The workout wear of the 80s combined with the more couture cut of the modern day. You can also see this combination of trends in the stacked bob haircut, which is the combination of the bob from the 20s with the precision cut style of the 2000s. The fashion for men was also a combination or variation of all previous styles, from vintage to ethnic to global. David Beckham's faux hawk, Justin Bieber's teen mop top, emo hairstyles, they are all a variation of past decades. By 2010, hipster fashion was at its peak, and the beards of the 70s made a full comeback. MySpace, which led the fashionistas of Facebook in the 2000s, paved the way for the new Instagram influencers by 2010. Social media changed the industry's fashion focus from previously following movie stars or rock bands to now the girl or guy next door. Pop culture, the fast pace of social media information highway, and mega influencers like the Kardashians all drove trends faster than ever and focused on presenting yourself as you want to be perceived. The story of this decade is to celebrate who you are versus a world where everyone used to try to blend in. Because megastars like Lady Gaga and Adele, Rihanna, and Beyonce are all advocates to be proud of who you are, hair trends respond with a celebration of natural textures in hair and pride of heritage. Gray hair began to trend because it set you apart from others. Hair color placements went from the frequent salon visits of the 2000s to a more grown-out look, using techniques like balayage that showed you were not afraid to show your true colors. Men's trends also followed suit into a mismatch of past decades' trend variations. From the man bun to grunge to raver fashion, men were following suit with more extreme haircuts and colors to keep and grow their social media followings. 2020 brought a brand new twist to fashion, proving that trends are not always driven by pop culture. 2020 is the year that COVID-19 became a household name and caused mass disruption to everything we knew it to be: fashion, business, everyday life. But under the surface, trends still began to emerge nonetheless. With America on lockdown and in a world of Zoom meetings and work from home, clothing trends relaxed at a record pace. Focus from the waist up and only from the front showed a new digital reality that if you couldn't see it on camera, it didn't matter. Casual clothing, especially from the waist up, began to trend, and men's hairstyles began to for the brave man, at-home haircuts also drove the revival of haircut variations like the undercut and mullets from past decades. Women's trends were also altered during this time. Grown-out hair color, minimal makeup due to the wearing of face masks, resulting in a more acceptance of natural beauty. The reality and susceptibility of the COVID pandemic made most of us reassess everything about our lives and what's important to us. The importance of work-life balance, general happiness, the further acceptance of who we are as individuals and what is truly important to us. In the ever-expanding digital age that we all live in today, statement looks will become mainstream as individuals will be looking for more dramatic looks to help them stand out on TikTok and other social media platforms. But most importantly, the celebration of individuality and acceptance of all.